Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of the Byrna Bros podcast. Normally, it's myself and Brian Gans, our CEO, but Brian's splitting duties this week, opening our Nashville/Franklin, Tennessee Byrna store. So we're excited to be there. So he's holding fort away from the studio. And as a replacement, our very own Josh Sherrard, who you've probably seen in all of our videos and in various national news segments on all things that Josh does that makes him probably one of the most interesting men that I know. But on this episode, we have two special guests, Richard Hayes and Emily Taylor, also famously known as the Armed Attorneys, but they're doing business as the Walker Taylor Law Firm. But they recently had a very interesting video about Byrna, and I love the title, Burn, Byrna, Burn, or Baby Byrna, Burn, or where it was. It's very catchy for two lawyers. It's pretty good. That being said, they really address all the key questions and FAQs about, what are your rights are owning a Byrna, what are the legal ramifications in using a Byrna. So, Richard, Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have you. We watched that video and I was just like talking to my screen, like, let me answer that question for you. But obviously I couldn't because it was a YouTube video. So we figured that we reach out, invite you on the show, and let's just have, a nice discussion about everything Byrna and what you guys are doing and how we're all really working to keep Americans educated and safe. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Of course. So, how did the whole Byrna platform pop up on your radar? I mean, I assume that you were getting a lot of questions and from your fans and viewers. And how do we pop up in your world?
Yeah, I will say that, it was a couple years ago, we stopped by the booth at SHOT Show and we're like, well, this is pretty cool. And then all of a sudden, everybody wanted to know. I mean, we got, how many questions do you think we got on Byrnas?
Yeah, it was more of a self-preservation on behalf of our law firm, like phone system of, hey, can we just make a video and tell everybody the same thing? So, but we got, I would probably say hundreds of questions about the Byrna.
Yeah, between the firm and between the channel. I mean, Everybody wanted to know, hey, is this, are they what they say they are? And what are the repercussions? And if I use it, what's going to happen? So it was time to make a video.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so what were the initial questions? Like, is this legal for me? How does this work? And where are you guys doing business at? What state are you doing business out of? Is it Texas?
Yeah, so we're primarily located in the greater Houston area. We're criminal defense attorneys, both former prosecutors, and we handle almost exclusively self-defense and firearms cases. And so we probably see between 400 and 500 critical incidents in our office every single year. So, I mean, we really have our finger on the pulse of what's going on with self-defense in the state of Texas. And we have a great network of attorneys that we have the privilege of working with, and we get to see self-defense all over the place. And so, really it came up in I would say the initial question is, hey, what level of force is this? Yes. When would it be justified? Is this a firearm? Kind of the...
What am I going to be charged with?
Yeah, that's
is another one. Is, hey, if I have to use this thing, what does that mean in the legal system?
Yeah, interestingly enough, like when we had our aha moment about the Byrna platform and what it really means to as business people, right, to bring this to market. And one stat that Josh and I always talk about, Josh, former SWAT commander, sniper, badass guy, is that 99% of all altercations in the U.S. do not require a lethal response. And so as gun owners, we realize, like, oh my gosh, we've only really calculated for that 1% of...
Closer to 0.01%. Yeah, 0.01%, I think, is the, less than that. So, yeah.
Wow, it's wow. So 99.9% of the time. And given that America has become a more litigious country, for better or for worse, we thought, like, wait a minute, we just can't have the nuclear option in our toolbox, which is the firearm, as our only, answer to any situation. So that's where the impetus of the Byrna came into play. And said, like, what about the other 99%, right? And what's funny is when we first introduced this product, and we went to our first SHOT Show, and the gun industry was like, oh my gosh, what are you guys, a bunch of vegan, Birkenstock wearing, granola crunching, tree hugging people doing here? What is this less lethal product, and why are you even here? And as we articulated the situation, like, hey, we're like you guys. We're a group of common sense gun owners that realize that if we resort to the firearm first, we could put ourselves in major legal jeopardy, and the fact that one bullet can ruin many lives. And so it's over time, and having folks like Dan Bongino, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, everybody supporting us in the firearms world, slowly became we're embraced in that community. And it's also to people like yourselves that want to educate the masses about, okay, what are my options from a continuum of force perspective, right? And so, like, in dealing with those types of cases, are you seeing a lot of folks getting in really hot water, and to have that moment where they watch, in the movies, uh it's so sexy and machismo to just fire your gun and the bullets magically disappear and you go home and you save the gal in your 67 pickup, right? But the reality is, when you fire that bullet, and wherever, if it hits its intended target or not, most of us will have the that moment where it's like, oh my gosh, what have I done?
Yeah, and it's funny, and we can talk about what's happening in sort of district attorneys' offices with criminal charges, but you mentioned that America is getting more and more litigious, and that's really one of the big changes we've seen over about the last decade. I mean, and Richard can check me on this if he thinks that my numbers are skewed, but I'd say in terms of people filing civil lawsuits, and this is the bad guy, right? This is the guy who got shot, or his family or his estate representatives. We've seen probably, I mean, I'd call it a 500% to 700% increase in that behavior. Why? Because plaintiffs' attorneys are eternally scummy, and they will file any lawsuit. But also, the insurance companies are paying out. But the thing is, you put a bullet in someone's body, live or die, there is a lot of money to be had from that, not necessarily your sort of less than lethal options. So, I mean, if you're worried about your civil lawsuit, about somebody coming after you for your bank account because you had to defend yourself, man, I'd rather not have had to shoot somebody with a gun.
Yeah, and I think your number is spot on. I think we've seen about a fivefold increase in the past 2 years just from what we were seeing a decade ago. And it's part of it is the scummy plaintiffs attorneys. They figured out the game. They just figured out they can shake people down for money. Most people settle to go away. But I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if it's all revolves around actual damages, and a use of force always has less damages than a dead person. So and it's a good self-defense principle. We always go back to it. And sometimes, you have to use deadly force to stop the threat. There's no reasonable, safe alternative. You got to do it. But I mean, it's a good self-defense principle, using the least amount of force necessary to stop the threat. If you can stop the threat with less force than deadly force, I'm going to tell a client to do that every single day.
Yeah. I mean, Josh probably, sorry to interrupt, but can speak to this. I mean, it seems to us from our end that when you pull out a gun, you're probably going to use it, even if the situation doesn't call for it.
You better use it at that point.
Yeah.
If it's gotten to that point, and that brings up an interesting, kind of flip side to that. So my last decade in law enforcement, I saw a very similar occurrence on the criminal side of shootings. It started in law enforcement, and then we started to see it creep into that civilian sector where, shootings that would have been completely righteous and justified, 15, 20 years ago, all of a sudden, now we're starting to see more and more prosecution on some of these shootings that were deemed unreasonable. And, my question, and without violating any of your current cases, maybe cases already been adjudicated that you've worked on, have you seen the same trend? And is there a case that you kind of remember where it's like, man, back in 1999 or 2000 or something, this would have been fine. But now we're seeing this trend where some of this deadly force is not reasonable anymore.
Yeah, I mean that's I have a specific term for it that Emily hates.
Oh God.
We call it the training trickle.
We don't call it that.
I call it that. But we see this, and it's what we see happening in law enforcement today. What standards law enforcement are being held today. That's the standard that's going to be held against civilians in a decade. I mean, you mark my words. I mean, and what we saw how law enforcement was treated a decade ago, that's how they're being treated today. I mean, there's almost an expectation at this point in time that civilians de-escalate. I mean, you don't get any. I mean, if you have a Texas license to carry, for example, you get a few minutes of de-escalation training. But I mean, we're not law enforcement, right?
Mm-mm.
And so I think it's an unfair expectation. But we do.
Well, we say a lot, and I pretend to put on my Richard and Emily hat. So, like, we say, like, look, for law enforcement, you have to follow a protocol called force continuum. And we highly recommend that for citizens as well. So let's just say someone's in my house. I verbally command them to leave, get out of my house, and then deploy less lethal. And if the threat continues, then I have them forced to elevate to lethal. And let's say I take lives, right? Because there's more than one, never one intruder in your home. There are always multiples. And if I'm in court, criminal or civil, my attorney will say on my behalf, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client had intruders in his home. He verbally commanded them to leave. Unfortunately, they did not comply. He then deployed less lethal, and it was never his intention to take a life. He went out and bought a Byrna for that very reason. Unfortunately, they did not comply, and in facing imminent threat, and in fear of his life and those of those in his home, he had no choice but to escalate to lethal force. And that's why we find ourselves today. And like I said, I like that defense better than, hey, my clients were in your home, they were intoxicated, they were unarmed, and they mistaken your house for their house, but somehow you decided that you could play judge, jury, and executioner. And I'm telling you, like, any lawyer that is even a first year out of law school does due diligence and finds that you have assets that they can sink their teeth into, you're over. Game over for you. And there's a lot of collateral damage, not only to the shooter, the person getting shot, their family, the shooter's family. So there's a mess of people out there that can get destroyed for reaching for the wrong weapon at the wrong point in time.
Yeah, I mean, that's our principle of avoidance. And that's what we try to tell people all the time, is that even though, I mean, specifically in Texas, avoidance is not written into the law, right? I mean, we have stand your ground protections, we have reasonableness, but it is one of those things that resonates so soundly with your jury. If you could have done anything but shoot that guy and have protected yourself and your family, you better have done it. You better have avoided that as best you can, because the jury cares when they're evaluating what you did. You asked about if we have sort of cases that sort of exemplify sort of what's going on with people right now. I'll tell you right now, we've got a murder trial coming up in just 2 months.
Yeah, this would have never been indicted 5 years ago.
No, I mean, my client had burglars on his property. They were convicted felons. They brought guns. He shot and killed one. And, sure enough, we have this issue where the state's like, did you really have to kill him, though? This is in Texas. This is, believe it or not, rural Texas. It's not even in Houston.
I mean, they identify the guy with his TDCJ, his prison identification.
Which was nestled next to his meth pipe. So, but yep, sure enough.
You go from, the Joe Horn case out in Pasadena that happened in the early 2000s, where he killed somebody on the neighbor's property, and he was no build.
With the 911 operator screaming at him not to go out and do it.
Do not go out, not go out. And he's like, well, I'm going anyway. And you talk about the pendulum swing. I mean, that's scary.
Yeah. So I'll give you an interesting Byrna stat. So last year we did a little over $85 million in sales, up from $42 million a year before. This is all public information. And the top 4 selling states for us, and the majority of our business is online, so we get to have a lot of customer data. Number 1 is California, because of the sheer size and the fact that the laws are all jacked up, very hard to get a gun, lots of crime, homelessness, all of it. But this very close second is your great state of Texas, where we were kind of blown away by that, because, there's that, image of Texas where they shoot first and ask questions later. And now I think people are starting to realize, like, wait a minute, that's not something that I want to do because I'm going to have to lawyer up. I'm going to have to take time off work. It's going to be a mess if I go with the nuclear option, right? Lethal. And the third best selling state for us is Texas' kissing cousin, Florida. And so, same, very, liberal gun laws. Liberal is the wrong choice of words. Loose gun laws, but they also realize that resorting to the nuclear option is not a good idea. And followed by New Jersey. So, two very red pro-gun states sandwiched between two very liberal Democratic states. So, our position has always been if you're a person, you need options. And Byrna needs to be part of your arsenal. And if you're a person that's adverse to guns, this is the closest thing that's going to give you the formidable stopping power without all the complexities of dealing with a homicide. And so and for us, it's really all about if you fear for your personal safety, Byrna needs to be a part of your strategic self-defense, personal protection perspective. And what's as I mentioned earlier, we were deemed as the vegan gun company, right? And so recently in this year's SHOT Show, we were invited to the main floor of the show. And if you're familiar with SHOT as you are, you guys have attended, all starter brands start in the basement, right? So it takes about 10 years to crawl yourself out of the basement. And this year, in year 3, we got invited to, the the main show, if you will. And one of our announcements at that show was our partnership and alignment with the USCCA. Are you familiar with that organization? And
Yeah.
so, obviously, arguably the biggest gun insurance platform in the U.S. Right, about a million members. And they're doing an incredible job. And we met with them and we said, look, you guys create incredible content, but at the end of the day, you're an insurance company. And given that, if you were in an altercation and you had to write checks for your clients, would you like to write checks for a fender bender, which is a Byrna, or a total collision, which is lethal? And everybody nodded, and then I was like, this makes a lot of sense because for the USCCA and their membership, as you know, it protects any member in a self-defensive situation if they defended themselves with a 6-iron, a Byrna, or a firearm. So I it was a very pivotal moment for our brand because we are now in this space, and I think we are literally on the porch, on the precipice of creating a paradigm shift where we can get 5% of the 100 million gun owners in America to reach for a Byrna first. How many lives do you think we save, right? And for you all, like how do you kind of, I mean, I'm sure in your work you've seen people's lives get devastated just for making the wrong decision when danger presented itself. Like, can you share with our audience, what that
Yeah.
journey is like?
Well, yeah, and I think this is a good law to illustrate it, and it is. I mean, I've had a client who's had to deploy a Byrna before, and so with especially with like dog, this is unique to Texas, I think. Attacking dogs in Texas, we just do not have good self defense laws against dogs, and it just seems like anytime a gun gets discharged, our law contemplates that you're responding to unlawful force from a person or or unlawful deadly force from a person. They don't ever contemplate a dog. So dog law is terrible in Texas. And it seems like any time a firearm is discharged in connection to an attacking dog, well, guess what? Somebody's going to go to jail. We have to rely on the defense's necessity here in Texas, which is kind of this balancing act of, hey, the harm you caused is less than the harm you prevented. And so, for that reason, I talk to clients where they haven't had to, this is not Byrna related, but it's like, hey, if you go on a walk, 5 times a week and you're getting attacked by a dog, I always tell them, like, hey, look, you need to find some alternative to a use of deadly force just because our self-defense laws are so weak when it comes to dogs. And so, having that intermediate option wherever, if the only tool you have is a hammer, guess what? Everything's a nail. I mean, having an intermediate tool whether it's a burner or a club or, chemical spray. I mean, I think it's very important.
And along those lines, I would love for you guys, just real briefly, without, going into too terribly much detail, but, with your expertise and the fact that you guys see this so much, I don't think a lot of gun owners understand what happens on the right side of bang. That they, even the ones that go out and train, that feel confident with their firearms and confident that they could pull the trigger. I don't think they quite understand, the process after that happens. So and I know every case is very different and can be different, but on the aggregate, what can somebody expect if they're going to use lethal force on somebody? What can somebody expect to happen, from bang to the right and all the way to a possible trial?
Yeah, I mean, I can just as brief as I can. I mean, and this as well. I mean, the first thing that's going to happen is you are going to sit in the sweaty back of a squad car for about 4 to 6 hours while they work everything out. Maybe you're going to get to speak to anyone. Maybe you're going to get to check on your family members to make sure they're okay, but probably not. Probably you're just stuck. You're the criminal. You're going to be interrogated. You're going to be asked to waive your rights, which you're going to wonder, should I do this or should I not? Because I know that I just shot a bad guy and I saved my own life or the life of someone I love, but I also know there are consequences for murder. And by the way, the attorney answer is don't give any of those statements. Yeah. And at that point, it starts to be a choose your own adventure. Are you going to get arrested right then? And are the consequences going to kick in immediately? You're not getting that gun back. You're going to go to the jail. You're going to have to post a bond, which is going to, for murder, sit anywhere from $50,000 to $250,000 probably. You're going to have your face splashed all over the news, likely. You're going to have to hire an attorney. You're going to go through the stress of going to the grand jury. You're hopefully going to have an attorney who's competent enough to create a grand jury defense for you, but that's not cheap. And at that point, you proceed normally towards your trial in 2 to 3 years if you're lucky.
The whole time. I mean, you're showing up every single month.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting
lost your job.
Yeah, you've lost your job, so you have no income. You're getting randomly called in to the probation, the supervision department to get drug tested. Maybe you're on house arrest.
If you're in a big county, you either have a GPS or house arrest.
Yeah, I mean, and then maybe ultimately you're acquitted.
Maybe.
And what is this? I mean, obviously every case is different, but what is this costing you? I mean, literally, we've seen what it costs you holistically, but what is this costing you financially?
You can't afford it. I mean, that's why legal services companies exist in the world, is because, retaining an attorney on a murder is going to cost $100,000 minimum. If that's what you're dealing with. So you've got court appointed lawyers, you've got legal services programs, or you're very lucky and very wealthy. I mean, if you're Robert Durst, then you can retain all the murder attorneys that you need, but most people can't do that. And just the process. I mean, I'll tell you, I, at this point, cannot count the number of times I have walked into a courtroom on a murder and negotiated with prosecutors and had them say something to the effect of, boy, I sure wish that guy hadn't died, because then we could do something on this case. But when it's a murder, the answer is go to prison I'll give you a sweet 20-year prison offer, or you're going to go to trial.
And that's the toughest part of self-defense cases. It's all or nothing. Mm-hmm. It's either you're a free man or you're going to go to prison for maybe the rest of your life. I mean, there's really no in between.
Yeah, what I've seen recently is the deals aren't like they used to be, and they're very less concerned with, just securing a guilty verdict or securing a guilty plea than they are just, we'll risk it and we'll roll the dice and go to trial.
Oh yeah, and it is, political, and it's the way the winds are blowing, and I very much hope that pendulum is going to swing back. But man, right now, there is not a political figure out there who isn't terrified of doing anything but letting a jury decide these questions.
Man, that is absolutely terrifying. That is
So
absolutely terrifying.
I'm fascinated by the cost of this because not a lot of people have 100,000 just sitting around, and so that's the retainer year one. If you've stated that it's a 2 to 3 year process, is that enough to cover that journey, or are you completely bankrupt on a 3 to 500 thousand
Yeah.
dollar financial commitment to try to ensure your freedom?
Depends. Attorneys run their own railroads. So, and people will walk in the door and you look at the case and you look at the complexity and you decide, when this case goes to trial, how long am I shutting my office down and what do I need to compensate myself for that? How many hours am I going to go into this? And, I'm sure, and Richard can correct me if he thinks this is wrong. I can conceptualize a case where you take a $50,000 retainer and $50,000 for trial and it's $100,000 said and done. There are lots of cases that cost a lot more than that, but there aren't a lot of murders that cost less.
Yeah, it is a choose your own adventure, and every attorney is going to be different. But I'll say, for example, we structure a lot of our agreements with clients with the hopes that, hey, maybe we can get your case no billed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, maybe there's a structure and a representation up to indictment, a representation after indictment, a representation up into, and so you try to break it up and make it as, none of this is manageable. Let's put that out there, but you try to make it manageable. And obviously the incentive is you want to get this thing kicked as early as humanly possible. I have clients, if I could snap my fingers, I'd make your case go away tomorrow. That's what I want. But it's not up to me. It's up to the prosecutor. It's up to a grand jury. It's up to a trial jury. And so, it's going to depend. Hopefully you can find something that works with an attorney.
Yeah.
And like you said, this is just for the criminal side.
Oh, yeah.
500% increase we've seen in civil side. That's a whole different
In the gun world, there's a popular phrase that goes something like this. I'd rather be carried out by 6 than judged by 12. And we always, respond. Our response is, well, that may be true, but those 12 that are judging you are going to bury you alive. And there's just the thought of sitting there watching your freedom, getting stripped from you, and then they start to peel off the assets. Like I think that's probably a worse scenario for me than death, to be honest, because
yeah,
I can't tell you how many good cops that I've seen that gotten good, righteous, justifiable shootings, but the 2+ years that they were, that it was in litigation just destroyed them. It just destroyed them personally. They couldn't take it anymore. And they left the industry, they left the profession, and they were great. And it was so sad to see that. But now we're seeing that so much, from my perspective on the civilian side, and it's the same story.
Yeah, no trial lawyer ever has said flippantly that they'd be judged by 12. It's
Exactly.
That's
That's
not something you want. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And if you had some parting advice for folks, going into this space, looking at different options to protect themselves and their family, because as Americans we have that right, and the right to bear arms and all of that great, all those great protections. And so, how would you advise a person that's now like has major concerns about their personal safety? How should they look at it, and what do they need to do to cover themselves in the eyes of the law?
Yeah, what I would say is, most folks, I think when they think about, self-defense scenarios, they think of the absolute worst case scenario of, hey, getting robbed at the gas station. And these happen. Don't get me wrong. Getting the door kicked down in the middle of the night, these things. But I would really urge people to focus on their lifestyle and think about, hey, what's the most likely scenario going to happen to me? And not all these situations that come up do require a firearm. Some of them do, yeah. I will say.
I'll give you a hint. It's going to be your drunk neighbor who hates you.
Yeah, it's going to be the attacking dog. It's going to be the road rage.
Yeah.
It's going to be the bar fight. That's probably the top 5 things we see. Those are them right there. Do most of those require a firearm? No.
Every tool. Utilize every single tool, because Richard's exactly right. Everybody who's self-defense minded tries to crystal ball, okay, what am I going to do when this? What am I going to do when this? And it's always that I'm minding my own business and the worst thing happens to me. And ultimately, when you have to defend yourself, it's not those things. It's something that is so gray and like squishy, and you probably were mouthing off to your neighbor before he came over and attacked you. I mean, I'm, you know, and people don't believe me when I tell them that, but I promise you. So every tool at your disposal is so incredibly important. Firearms are important. Everything else is important too, because the scenario that you're imagining is probably the least likely thing that you're going to encounter, and your most likely encounters can be easily solved with different tools.
And I love how Richard put it. When all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail.
You know,
That's
I have
so
a fonder respect of your armed attorney title there, because it's really armed with knowledge, right? Armed with situational awareness, armed with all the things that you need to think about before you do what you're going to do that could change your life forever. And no one has ever said after pulling a trigger on a firearm that, wow, that made my life better. You know, it's definitely going to make it a lot worse. So we really appreciate the public service that you all are doing just to get folks educated and really prepare. We like to say here, prepare to defend, and making sure that you have all the bases covered. So thank you so much, Richard, Emily. You guys are doing a great job. Thank you for calling out Byrna. We're so grateful that you were able to join us today. And if we can return the favor on joining the Less Lethal Armed Attorneys special episode, we're happy to do that.
Awesome.
Well, we had a great time. Thanks for inviting us.
Cheers. Have a
Thanks,
good
guys.
one.